So welcome to the Performing Advanced Fire Validation session. My name is Tani, and let me start out with a why did the chicken cross the road kind of a question. So why did the fire resource fail its validation? Any idea? Well, because it didn't have the proper rest. Well, I don't know if you find that funny. If you want to know where that joke came from, maybe somebody has a guess. Where did I get that joke from? Where do people get anything these days? ChatGPT, right? So I was asking Chat, tell me, give me a joke for fire, HL7 fire validation. And he said, sure, here's the joke. So here's that for you. So this is me. InterSystems has been celebrating now 45 years. So about half of that time I've been at the company, so about 22 years. And the last few years focused a lot on fire. So I'm here today, but actually a person who's not here today physically, but is with us in spirit, is my colleague Dimitri. And he's actually the creator of what you will be seeing today. He's like a guru in a lot of fire projects we do around the world. He couldn't come, so I'm presenting here today. So I'm showing this for two reasons. First is because he deserves the credit. And the second is if you have any problems with it, you'll know who to turn to. So let's sort of set the grounds of what we want to achieve in this session today. So there are three important goals. So the first is to understand what fire validation actually is. And you'll see it might be obvious, but might not be obvious. The second will be to understand when and what kind of validation we want to do. Okay, that won't be so obvious either. And the third will be how we actually go ahead and implement this advanced fire validation. And I want to do some sort of expectation setting with you. So the first two parts are not going to be really code intensive, right? We're just going to talk theory. The third part will be code. So that's one thing to have in mind. The second thing, and don't worry, that code will be on Open Exchange. Okay, so everything, you don't have to pick up your phones and start clicking. You can do that, but thank you, Yafit. Yafit is the, thanks. What we're not going to do today is we're not going to get into fish, right? Fire shorthand. By the way, Patrick did last Global Summit a great session about that. So if you're interested, you can look at that recording. We're not going to talk about sushi. You can eat sushi, but we're not going to talk about sushi today, which is unshortening the fire shorthand. Java Gateway, by the way, is something we'll be talking about, but not get into any details about. Creating implementation guides, we'll mention that, but again, we're not going to get into that. And how to customize the fire server is something we'll be using, but again, we're not getting into too much details. Yesterday there was a session about that, so I'll sort of refer you to that later. So that's what we want to achieve today. So this is the agenda, right? So we're talking about the types of validation, what is fire validation, considerations of when exactly what we want to validate. We'll see what is currently out of the box with Iris for Health, what isn't yet, and then see what we can do already today. Any type of validation you want to implement, how you can do it today. So that's what we'll set out doing. So the first is we'll be talking about what is validation, what kind of validation types we have. And the truth is you've been doing validation all your life already, right? You've been validating stuff. So what's new, what's special about fire validation? So let's talk about that a little. And I put a little example here of a fire resource. This is a patient. Her name is Sandy Not So Well. By the way, she was so not so well that she was deceased, but I sort of removed the deceased part because I wanted to start on her right leg. So let's look at this resource and see what kind of validations you would want to do on this resource. Any ideas? Right, what would you want to validate here? Medical records required. Okay, so you are Preston. Okay, so Preston is saying to see if something is required, right? So some of the elements might be required. Any other ideas? What else would I want to validate? Date of birth. Okay, so the date is valid, you're saying? Okay, great. That's Ed. Thanks, Ed. So that the date is valid. Any other ideas? What else do I want to validate? Code systems. Okay, that's Ken, right? Yep. Love your session yesterday. Okay. let's look. So we'll want to see, for example, that the JSON is valid, right? We don't want to get JSON that doesn't have closing brackets and stuff like that. So that's something we want to validate. We'll want to validate in my JSON structure, some of this thing is supposed to be primitive. Some of them might be objects. Some of them might be arrays. So I want to check that whatever is array is really an array. I want to check that the elements are in a specific structure, right? Patrick was saying before schema. So I want to see that all my schema is correct, that the elements I expect are there, those I don't expect are not there. I want to look at the data types, right? So Ed was mentioning a date. So we have a date might be a valid date, or something supposed to be a Boolean is actually a Boolean, right? So all of this stuff we'll want to validate in our resource, and there are more types of validation that we'll speak about soon. So let's look at something called the validatorfire.org. So I'll use this just as an example of what kind of validations we'll be looking at. You can access that. This is a UI, right? You can paste your resources here. You can upload your files. This is, of course, not something you're going to use in actual production, but it will be nice for us to use right now in our session as an example. By the way, what's behind the scenes of this validator is the validator we'll be using. Okay, so this is a UI of that. Okay, so let's look at the examples very quickly. So here, for example, under identify, I put an element called foo. Now, there's no element called foo. So we're getting an error, unrecognized property, right? By the way, look at Sandy here, right? So Sandy is supposed to be a person, a human name in FHIR could have several given names. By the way, I have 3. That's even not including Tani. So if I put Sandy as a primitive, it's going to tell me, sorry, it's not a primitive. It's supposed to be an array. Active, right? Active is supposed to be true or false. But if I'm saying it's 34, that's not a Boolean. Here we have a date, right? You remember Ed said date, so there is no month of 15. Dr. Seuss might say otherwise, but in reality, there isn't. Now, this is another type of validation. It comes back to what Preston, you remember, said required or something. So this is cardinality. So some elements I need 0 or 1 or more. So for example, an observation, this is already not a patient, this is an observation. Observation must have a status, at least one status, or one status, right? So it's saying minimum required 1, and I eliminated the status, so this is wrong, so I'm getting this kind of error. Now here, I'm putting gender foo. So gender is an issue today, but there still is no gender foo. So I'm getting an error again. Again, this is enumerated values, right? So this is not exactly the same as loin codes. We'll get to that in a second. This should be male, female, or other stuff like that. Or an observation status we were talking about before, right, can be final or other enumerated values. So this is not in the value set. That is correct. Here's another example. This time it is a loin code. So glucose is supposed to have an 8 in the end, not 999. So if I'm putting 999, it's telling me this is a wrong code. Now for this validation, the validator went out to a terminology server, okay? And it asked the terminology server about this code. By the way, this is a wrong code, but if it had the correct code but the wrong display value, right, I wouldn't call it glucose, I would call it schmucose, it would tell me this is also not valid. And don't call it schmucose. So observation also has a reference range, right? Reference range has to have at least either or a low value, high value, or text. This is called a constraint or invariant. This is also part of the FHIR spec, and it has to have one of those. And if I put a reference range without one of those, it's telling me, sorry, OBS3. OBS is like it's the name of, the name. You remember once I was giving a presentation, there was a sticker here on this thing. And I was very curious to see what it says. So I was going, and then it says, be careful not to look into the light. Okay. So, wasn't that funny, Afid? But thank you. For the next example, for profiles, let me give you a little introduction. So when the HL7 org set out to define the FHIR spec, they said, okay, it's supposed to cover, all of the data, all of the organizations, 100% of everything, but we want to leave room to adaptations, right? We're going to say, okay, by us in our country or in our organization or in our system, we do it a bit differently, right? So you can adapt those stuff, and to do that, you define profiles. And to illustrate this, we'll give an example of a patient, right? So a patient, according to the spec, has an identifier, but there could be between 0 and as many as you want identifiers. But in the US core, the US core defined that you must have at least one. Okay, so this is specific to the US core profile. So is a patient resource that doesn't have an identifier valid? Well, depends if you want to validate it against the US core profile or not, right? So sometimes we want to do profile-based validation. So in this case, you see the patient, I'm saying that the patient is I'm using the meta tag with the profile, and I'm saying this is a US core patient, and I don't have an identifier, so it's telling me minimum required 1. Okay, so again, this is failing because of the profile-based validation. Phew. So now you know all kind of types of validations. By the way, this is from the HL7 org page, the website. So you can see all the types we just saw. We spoke about the structure, right? What is the element, what is an array, and so on. What's a primitive value? Cardinality, for example, we saw that observation has to have at least one status. Value domains, we saw, for example, female or male for gender. Coding, we saw LOINC and SNOMED. Codes for glucose, for example. Invariance, like the example where we saw the observation reference range has to have either low, high, or text. And we saw the US core example for a profile where we have to have at least one identifier. Whew. So again, this is from the same page, and when we come to do validation, we have different options of what to do the validation with. So today we're going to use the validator. That's the HL7 org validator. And you can see it covers all of the types of validations we could be interested in. So that's great. And you can download the validator and read about it and learn about it from the Confluence page of the HL7 org. Okay, this is open source stuff, and you can take it and read it and so on. So we've spoken about what types of FHIR validation exists, what it actually means to validate FHIR. But now, we want to see, do I always want to do all of those validations? Or maybe why not? So let's talk about that for a little. So this is, again, from the same HL7 org page. And you'll see it's telling us two things that actually contradicts. So on one hand, it's telling us, hey, I'm not sure it's a very good idea to do validation in production environment. Why? Because it will be consuming my resources of, well, not FHIR resources, resources of the machine, right? And it's also going to be time consuming. It's going to take time. If I need to get back a response to my client, I don't have time to start churning on validation and stuff like that. I want to give a very quick response. So that's one problem. Second problem is that I might be losing data. Okay, imagine you're getting this huge bundle of FHIR, and you're going to be picky. You say, hey, you didn't put the right line code, right? Or, I don't know, you missed the low, high thing. Okay, so do you want that data or not? This is what I have. So take it. Okay, so that's another consideration. Maybe you don't want to lose data, so you want to take the data, even if it's not 100% kosher. Kosher? I eat kosher. And this problem is even worse if you're talking about historical data, right? So historical data, you don't even have anybody to talk to. Right? If it's a new client, you can say, hey, sorry, please fix this, fine, I'll get it back new. But if it's data that's there, so deal with it. So this is on one hand. On the other hand, the same page is telling us, well, it's not a good idea, but it might be very important. Okay, why is it very important? It's very important because you might have some security concerns here. And security, by the way, is becoming a serious issue with FHIR. I don't know if you feel it yet, but people are concerned that the FHIR server might become a parking lot for malicious code. Okay, so if you're not doing validation, you can put all kinds of stuff there, and attackers can use it. So be careful. So that's one consideration why you want to validate what's supposed to be really FHIR data is FHIR data and not other stuff. And also, think about the fact that the FHIR server might not be the final destination of that data. You might be streaming that to another system, and you don't want to throw garbage at that system. It's going to fail. Okay, so you have to do validation in order to provide pure FHIR data to the final destination of that data. So what do we do? So on one hand, they're telling us, OK, if you are the sending end of that data, okay, so be aggressive with your FHIR data. If you are on the receiving end, so maybe be a bit more lenient, right? Because, again, because of the reasons we mentioned before. And by the way, Grant Greaves, you heard of that name? Right? So he's like the father of FHIR, and he's also the creator of the validator that we'll be using. So this is what he said in the FHIR Dev Days conference. By the way, FHIR Dev Days is like one of the most leading FHIR conferences. It's actually happening today in Amsterdam. And this is what he says. So in a nutshell, he's saying during development, be aggressive. In production, it depends. So it depends, I guess. That's my message to you. It depends. But let me give you something that might be a bit more practical for you. So a few uses we're seeing in the field. So one approach, I'm calling it here the logging approach. It says like this. OK, do some basic validation. Get the data into your repository. Get a quick answer back. But then do the more advanced validation and log any errors. So you can look at it, you can clean it later, you can get back maybe to the client, say, hey, there was a problem, so fix it next time, whatever. Right? So this is one approach of doing that. Another approach, I call this the two-phase approach, says, OK, the first endpoint is going to be lenient, but then I'll be moving on to another endpoint. It might be a separate iris instance, might be the same instance, just a different endpoint, and that's where I'm going to do the more heavy validation. That means I have one FHIR repository with more sort of dirty data, but I did it quick and dirty. And in the second one, I have like more pure data, and I can take my time and be more picky and so on. Okay, so that's another approach. And for the next idea, let me give another small introduction. So, FHIR has interactions, right? Like read and search or create or update, but they're also operations. Right, FHIR operations. And operations typically start with a certain character. You know what that character is? Dollar. Yeah, dollar was with the magician this morning. He had the dollars. Yeah, but no, you're right. Dollar. So we have an operation called $validate. So $validate is an operation where you can post a resource to that endpoint, to that API, and it's not going to create a resource. It's going to tell you if that resource is valid, and if it's not, it'll tell you what the problem with that resource is. So that's $validate. We'll get back to it actually maybe a bit later also in the demo. So another idea could be, again, with that two-phase approach, is to do the actual validation on another iris endpoint. And all that is focused on validation, right? So this way, I'm not also consuming resources and so on. I'm doing that separately altogether. So that's another idea of how you can do the validation. So again, it depends, and you have a few ideas of what you can do with that. So we've spoken about what kind of FHIR validation types we have, and we spoke about different considerations you should keep in mind when you want to go ahead and do the validation. So now let's see, again, what is in Iris for Health today and what not yet. So for that, let's demo something with Postman. You see it okay? Yeah. I don't trust you. I really don't. Terrible. You see, you're lying. Or maybe people on the first line said it's okay. Oh, that helps. Thank you. Okay. You, Jose, I don't trust ever. Well, not ever, but yeah. Wait a second. Let me get my mouse here and do also this. We'll go through, for example, similar to the ones you saw on the slide. We'll go through them quickly. So we have one with a patient where we have foo in the identifier, right? So we're getting back an error of HS FHIR error, unexpected property name, foo is not valid for identifier. So let me just stress something. So this is going to a vanilla, out-of-the-box iris health server, okay? And this is what we're getting for this example. Let's look at, you remember when we put Sandy as the name, not in an array, right? So we have here given Sandy. So again, we're getting an error here of not an array, property given of type human name must be an array. And by the way, it's giving us exactly the path, right, where that happens, the error. Active 34, you remember that example? So, 45, yes, I tried to have new examples. So you see, again, active is supposed to be not a number, right? It's supposed to be Boolean. Invalidate, so we're getting the same type of error with the 15, right? So 15 is not a month, so we're getting the regex and so on. Gender, if I put gender foo, again, I'm getting the error that it shouldn't be foo. It should be either female, male, other, or unknown. So these are the errors I'm getting with the vanilla out-of-the-box Iris server. Let's look at some other cases. So here we have an observation, and in the reference range, I'm being a bad boy, and I don't have low, high, or text. So is this valid or not? It's not. Okay. But Iris is telling us all okay. Okay, so keep that into mind. Another example, we have the loin code 999. All okay. We have a US patient, okay, US core patient, without an identifier. Okay, so you have to believe me, there's no identifier here. And again, all okay. So to summarize this, what we're seeing is right now, in the current version, current general released availability release version, out of the list we were looking at before, we do the upper part of the validations, but not the looking up terminology, not those invariants like the low, high text stuff, and not profile-based validation. Okay? Today you'll learn how you can do them with Iris. Okay? But out of the box, no. The good news is that, stay tuned, coming to a theater next to you soon, it is planned for version 23.3. Right? Better? Yeah, I got it right. Okay. Again, if you have a problem with that, go to him, not Dimitri, not me. Okay. So 23.3, profile validation will be out of the box. This, by the way, is a sneak peek from the documentation of 23.3, where we see we document, we do all of the validation types that you just saw. So everything will just work out of the box, and that's great. But the purpose of what we want to see now is how you do it today. Okay, because like Jeff said earlier today, the 23.2 is now preview, but it will be released in July. So I don't know when 23.3 will be released, and let's say you need to do these types of validations today. So how you're going to do them, that's what we're going to show you now. Question. Yeah? Dollar validate is not available going back too many versions, but but quite a few. So we can check that later, President. Okay, President, right? Yeah. So it's easy to check, and it's been there for a while. I think you were 22. 21. I think it's there, but we can check. Okay. So advanced, how we actually do this advanced implementation. And again, I want to stress the fact that all of the code you'll be seeing today, you'll have on Open Exchange, on GitHub, so don't worry about all of that. So I want to go through with you the architecture of what we're actually going to be doing here. And let me say two things right now. This slide with two elements on it is going to get complex soon. We're going to sort of add stuff to it, and you're going to say, whoa. Okay? So when you say, whoa, keep in mind two things. One is Dimitri already built all of this for us. Okay? So it's all there already. The second thing is, after I finish building all this slide, we'll go one by one, and I'll explain to you what each one of the elements is Okay? But the reason we're going through it, even though Dimitri built it, is this is, again, unofficial InterSystems code. This is a sample, right? So if you use it and in a month you run into a problem and you call, hi, support, I have a problem with Dimitri's, they'll say, well, call Dimitri, right? So that's why I'm showing it to you, really, because you'll need to understand it and maybe you'll need to adapt it to, do some other stuff that is not exactly what Dimitri did. But that's fine. That's what we're going through, so you understand the architecture, understand exactly how it works, so you can use it. So let's see. So the easy part is, right, we have an Iris server, and we have that jar, validator jar, right? Jar is a Java archive. We downloaded that from the, you saw, the HL7.org Confluence page, right? So you have that. So we want Iris to use the Java validator jar when it performs its own validation. So how do we do that? So the first part is we have the Java gateway. Right, I mentioned that early on, and I'll say a few more words about that. But in general, Java Gateway is the way Iris can call out to jars. The second part that's in Iris is when you define a FHIR endpoint, I don't know if you've noticed, but there's sort of like a drop-down that's grayed out that you can choose the interaction strategy class. Okay? Now, for those of you who've been yesterday in Theo's session, this might ring a bell. But that actually means that you can choose another interaction strategy class of your own. And that's what we'll be looking at, how we'll be doing today. So we'll be taking the FHIR server framework classes. We'll look at that in a second. And we'll be specifically looking at the resource validator and see how we use that to play in this game. Around the Java side, we'll be creating a facade for the full jar, not to get mixed up with the next session, which is creating a FHIR facade, different use of the word facade. And we'll create a proxy class of that Java facade. Then, just to emphasize, all of this part is Java, right? So not ObjectScript, not anything, all of this stuff is Java. The jar is Java, the facade is Java, and the Java gateway, of course, is Java. Then we're going to have the validation class. So the validation class is really the side that connects our FHIR server classes with that jar and what wraps the jar. Okay? So validation class is really the connector of these pieces. This is the part where you say, whoa. Okay. So now we'll go one by one and start understanding what each one of these pieces actually does. So the first piece we'll talk about is what I call the FHIR server framework classes, right? And the slide we'll go through right now is a reminder for those who've been yesterday in Theo's session and sort of to be on the same page for those who haven't. But I do recommend that before you go ahead and start doing all of this, if you haven't been in Theo's session or you want a better reminder, go and listen to the recording of Theo's session yesterday. Okay? But let's put us all on the same page. So what we're saying, what we're doing when we're going ahead to implement this, is we need to extend 3 classes of InterSystems classes, and this will be the first step of our customization. And these are the repo manager, interactions class, and interaction strategy class. And there's really not much to do there. All you have to do is extend them. You have to put a little parameter that connects one to the other. So where the repo points to the interactions points to the interactions class, and that's it. It's extremely easy. No work there. And this you need to do for any customization of the FHIR server that you want to do. Nothing specific to validation. Okay? For validation, you'll need to extend this class as well, the resource validator. Okay, so you'll be extending that. And you'll be pointing your interactions class to that resource validator instead of the default resource validator. So it will be your resource validator. There is another topic, which is bundle validation. We're not going to get into that today, but I put it on the slide so you should know that if you also want to perform bundle validation, you need to add another 2 classes to this game. Right? So that is the bundle processors and the bundle validator. Okay? And in the bundle validator, again, you put all your bundle validation. But again, we're not going to focus on that. So that's the first step. Remember just what this is? This is, if he's blue, he's Leonardo. correct. And if it was red, it would have been Raphael. Are we done? Okay, thank you. So that was the FHIR server framework classes. It took a little longer than I thought. You know, the good news is that the next presenter is here, and I know her, so we'll see. So let's talk about the resource validator. So again, this is an InterSystems class that you're extending. So you see it's extending util resource validator. And all you have to do is override the validate resource method. In it, you see we're just calling the superclass. And then we're calling our validator, the class that we'll be creating, the FHIR validation class, calling its validate method. So nothing much really to do here, right? We're extending the class, overriding the method, and in that method, we're calling the superclass and our class. Our class. So that's the resource validator. Now let's move on to that side. So the validator jar, we said that's easy. You download it. Nothing much to really to say about it. The next part is the Java gateway. So we're not going to get into details about the Java gateway, but let's just remind us of what it actually is. So the Java gateway is the way of which Iris can talk to Java. So we have a separate Java process that runs somewhere. It can run on the same machine Iris is or on a separate machine, and it talks TCP with Iris on some port. And that's the way we call out to the Java classes. By the way, the demo I'm using now is actually using the Java gateway on a separate machine, well, a separate container. So I have one container running Iris and one container running the Java gateway. Coming back to what I was saying before about the considerations about FHIR validation, remember we talk about resource consumption. So this way, you're having the jar run in a separate container. So that could be a smart idea. That's why I did it. So that's the Java gateway. The validated facade. So the facade approach is something you should be doing with any external library you're using. Okay? It could be Java, .NET, sorry. Java, .NET, or whatever, anything else. Because typically you're taking a library which is huge, and you really need a certain small part of it. So the facade takes that small part that you'll be using. So this is the facade class. And again, we're not getting into all of the details. This is Java, right, like I stressed. One thing I want to point out is extremely important. Sometimes when I talk to people, I wink to the type of people I talk to. Sometimes when I talk to people, I think, what, you're using the validator jar? No, it's slow. You can't use it. It can't perform in real time in real production environments. And the reason is that if you download the validator jar and use it as documented in the page as a CLI, command line interface, every time validating a certain resource, it will take a long time. Now, why is that? Because when you run it from a CLI, every time the Java validator runs, it goes and imports, loads all of the schema it needs to validate. So imagine you're validating now the US core. So that's huge. And that will take a long time. And if you have to do that again and again for every resource, that's crazy. That will be really not performant, right? But what we're doing here is we're using, like, it's called a design pattern called singleton. So we have here a property, it's a field, right? A Java static field, which is the validator. So that's an instance of the validator. So indeed, in the first time you'll be using the jar, it will take a while. But from the second time on, it will fly because we loaded everything already. Okay, that's something important to keep in mind. So this is the init method or init function in that class, in the Java class. And you can say init, we do that load. So the first time we do the load when you initialize it, but that's it. And then we have the validate method where we call out to the validate method of the actual jar. So that's the facade. That's where we wrap the jar itself. So now we're moving on to the proxy. The proxy is really not much to say about that. It's auto-generated. You don't have to work at it at all. In fact, when we run the system and we see if the proxy class doesn't exist, we go and create it on the fly. So nothing really to say about that. But we do want to focus now on the validation class, right? That's where we said we connect the FHIR server framework classes to the actual jar. So here we have some sort of settings, some configuration where we set up. So we put it in like in the registry, in the portal of Iris, right? This is a out-of-the-box feature. So we set up stuff like where's the Java gateway, what port it's talking on, where's my terminology server and stuff like that. And then all we do is we have a validator method. We go and grab those values of those stuff with the terminology server and so on. We connect to the Java gateway, and then all we do is just call the validator method of that facade class that we created. That's it. Extremely easy. So we went through all of the items, and we have all the framework understood and working. Great. So let's demo this. Now let's see. Hello to you. Good. Thank you. So you remember I was saying before I was running against the vanilla Iris server. So now what we're going to do is we're not going to be running against a vanilla Iris server, but an Iris server where we customized, as you just seen, the FHIR validation. So we're going through all of that stuff to the jar and so on and so on. So let's see. So the first example I'll use is where we had the observation without the proper reference range. You remember that, right? No low, high, or text. And in this case, Iris is coming back to us with the error. Rule OBS3 must have at least lower. Great. Okay, so that's something we got back from Iris. We have a LOINC code that's wrong, right? You remember that 999 in the glucose. So there's no 999. And again, Iris is coming back with an error. There's no 999. Again, it went to the terminology server that we configured and checked that out. And the same for validation of a profile. Again, because of the mess, we're running out of time, so I'm not going to get into that too much. But just explain to you that we defined a custom profile. Again, this is not US core. This is like a local example we called my patient. And we said that my patient has to have a name, okay, at least one name. So in this case, it's telling us minimum required, and there is no name for this patient. And also, we defined an extension for birth sex, and again, where we put in a wrong value for the birth sex, we put in foo, and it's telling us, sorry, foo is not in the birth sex value set. So you can see that even with Iris, as it is today, thanks to Dimitri and what he built, we can do current validation, advanced validation of any type of validation you want to do. Again, this is the example of the patient. So it's on Open Exchange. All you have to do is search either for Dimitri or for he called it FHIR profile validation. And you can get that, and that's very easy. We won't have too many time for questions, but before the question, again, this is something that our learning services is putting together. They're putting together a tutorial for Iris for Health. And if you want to influence what that tutorial is going to be about, you can answer this 2-minute survey and choose a topic that's interesting for you. We've had a lot of FHIR content during Global Summit. There's still some to come. So this was yesterday, but again, everything is recorded on the app. You can also access the presentations. They'll also be uploaded. This is today and will be today. This is Demo and Drinks yesterday, but if you missed it, come to the Tech Exchange. You have more stuff. You can find somebody who can tell you about any one of these topics. And nobody's going after the break. You're all coming back here because Karen, there's Karen. Thank you, Karen. We'll be talking about building a FHIR facade. And I'll just leave you off with another question. So why did the FHIR validator get lost? Well, because it couldn't find its way through all the required fields. So you know where that joke came from. Okay, thank you. So seriously, any questions, welcome. Oh, I can ask. Then I'll go. So I'll test you. How old is my oldest daughter. Oh, sorry, Michael, yeah. Eighteen, good. I think Michael wanted to ask. Are you giving the mic? Yeah, mic to mic. But make it easy, please.
I was curious if you compared performance with the IBM validator that's also a jar, or if you tried that out at all. Did you find performance differences?
Right. So no, but I hope somebody we both know did.
Yeah.
And I'm not going to name her. Great. It was a pleasure. Thank you very much.